הייתה לי עמדה של מסאז'ים, הכל היה מדהים עד שהגיע שעה 6 בבוקר. אנחנו רואים שובלים של טילים עולים לאוויר, באותו רגע עוצרים את המוזיקה, צועקים, המסיבה נגמרה, כולם נכנסים לפאניקה, מתחילים להתפנות, לא יודעים מה לעשות, שוכבים על הרצפה, רצים לכל מקום, נהיה כאוס רציני במתחם. התחלנו לשמוע יריות מרחוק, מסתכל על הג'יפ, אנחנו נכנסים לתוך סרט.
אל תצאו משם.
מה יש?
מלא מחבלים ברחובות.
האנשים תופסים את הראש, מה עושים? התחיל להתקרב הירי 400 מטר, 300 מטר. מתחילים לרוץ לכיוון החניות, עולים על הג'יפ, מתחילים לנסוע בין אנשים, בין הקנטות עם הג'יפ. איכשהו מצליח לצאת לחניה האחורית, אני רואה חוליה של איזה 30-40 מחבלים עם נשקים, מתחילים להיכנס לתוך המתחם ולראות פשוט, ואני רואה אנשים רצים לכיוונים מהיציאות ופשוט נופלים כמו ברווזים. נתתי פרסה, אני רואה את חבר שלי אוהד, רץ אליי בפאניקה עם הידיים, חולצה אדומה, מסתכל לי, אומר לי, תעלה אותי לאוטו, תעלה אותי לאוטו. ואז אנחנו רואים ג'יפ צבאי נטוש, דוד, מונה, עם טמבון מפורק, אין חיילים בפנים, אין חיילים מסביב. ראיתי שם נשק עם 16 מקוצר, לקחתי את הנשק, זרקתי אותו אחורה לגלעד, תפעל את המעצור. מתחבאים בין השיחים, מגיעים לאיזושהי אנטנה. אלכס פורק מהרכב לדבר עם אשתו. אוהד גם יורד מהרכב, אמרתי להם תשארו קרובים. מגיעה חוליה של מחבלים על שני רכבים ואופנועים. צועקים לנו וואקף, וואקף, אני אומר להם תעלו לאוטו. ללי מספיקה לעלות לאוטו, גלעד עולה לאוטו מאחורה, אוהד ואלכס בורחים לשיחים. משם אני באתי איתם לתקשורת, ברחנו מהם. ללי מתקשרת למשטרה, אומרת להם תעלו את האיכון שלנו, אומרים אין לנו דרך, תשכבו על הרצפה, תחפשו מקום מחסה. אמרה לו רודפים אחרינו, אני מסתכל על ללי, אני מסתכל על גלעד, ללי רואה אופנוען, סע. אנחנו מגיעים לכביש עוקף עד בארי, אני לא יכול לתאר את זה אפילו. מגיע לציר, אני רואה 5 אופנועים חולפים אותי, מחבל מגיע עם אופנוע מול הפרצוף שלי, המחבל מסתכל לי בעיניים והוא צועק על יהוד, ידבח על יהוד. ואז התחילו עלינו מרדף, אני חותך לו שמאלה בפרצוף, התחלתי לנסוע ימינה שמאלה, דורים עלינו עם הקלרים מאחורה, מנסים לפגוע בנו. אני מזגזג עם הג'יפ ימינה שמאלה, להרים עננה לאוויר, כדי שלא יצליחו הצלפים להוריד אותנו, והמקלרים, גלעד מקבל רסיס לתוך הראש מכאן. הוא צועק, ירו לי בראש, גלעד תחזיק את הפצע חזק, תלחץ חזק. תוך כדי שאחד האופנועים נצמד אליי, אני נותן לו מהחלק הקדמי של האוטו, עם הטמבון. הבן אדם עף מהאופנוע לתוך התעלה, מישהו אחר מנסה להגיע אליי מצד ימין, אני נותן לו אחת עם הצד של האוטו, מעיף אותו לתוך הגדר. אנחנו מצליחים איכשהו לזגזג, לברוח מהם. אנחנו רואים רכבים, מרוססים. גופות על הרצפה, אנשים מפורקים לחלקים. אין סיכוי אני נכנס לשם, אין סיכוי. אם לשער, אין נפש חיה. אני לא יודע איך תאר את הסיטואציה הזאת לרגע שאתה מגיע למקום, שאתה רואה את הש"ג כדורים בתוך השמשה. אנחנו שומעים יריות מתוך היישוב, הגענו לשם עם הג'יפ, התחבאתי איתו מתחת לעצים, מפנים את גלעד, מדמם. אנחנו רצים לתוך איזה מבנה שירותים רעוע, בלי מנעול, שובר את הזכוכית מכאן. הכנסתי אותם, רגע, יש לנו פה אזעקה. בכל מקרה, מגיעה חוליה של איזה 30 מחבלים, התחילו לראות על כל הדלתות. היינו חסרי אונים. הנשק היה זרוק באוטו תקול, אין לנו מה לעשות. נופל עלינו חתיכות של הפירורים של התקרה, תופסים את הראש למטה חזק. התבצרנו בתוך השירותים האלו במשך 6 שעות של אימה. רק משמיעה, שאתה שומע את הצרחות, שומעים את הטילים, שומעים את היריות של האקדח, את היריות של הקלאצ'ים. שמע ישראל, שמע ישראל, שמע ישראל. אני שומע מרחוק רכב מגיע, עוצר את האוטו, צעקות, מעינית אני רואה 2 חיילים. עם קסדות, וסטים, נשקים. אני מזהה את השפה הצה"לית, כאילו, אי אפשר לקחת את זה. עכשיו זה ההזדמנות שלנו לצאת מפה עכשיו. עלינו על האוטו, הכל שרוף, ריח של שרוף, גופות שרופות של רכבים שרופים. הגענו להלומים, הגענו לכוח צה"לי. ירדה לי אבן קטנה מהלב. הצלחנו לפנות את גלעד ואת הפצוע, הם פונו, ופשוט נסעתי ב-150 קמ"ש ולא עניין אותי כלום, פשוט רק רציתי להגיע הביתה. אנשים לא יחזרו להיות מי שהם, גם עם החברים שיחזרו מעבר לגבול שלקחו אותם, לא יחזרו להיות אותו דבר. מלא גופות, מלא אנשים פצועים שלא יכולנו לעשות בשבילם כלום. צריכים לשתוק על הדבר הזה.
Hello, my name is Marco, pastor of Community Church of Devore, and this is our prophecy update. I normally take some days off during the year from teaching, preaching, counseling, and researching just to spend time with my family. This week was one of those days. In 2005, I remember my wife and I, with our oldest, were traveling and taking some time off when we sat there and got the news that the Jews were being expelled from the Gaza Strip. at the behest of the Bush administration, the Cheney administration, and Condoleezza Rice, working along with Ariel Sharon and the Israeli left wing of their government, that the best course of action was for peace was to give up Gaza, have the Jews expelled from Gaza, and give it to the Palestinians, who in turn voted in Hamas, a terrorist organization, as their government. Not too long after the Jews were expelled from Gaza, the terrorists began to launch rockets into southern Israel. And it's been like that ever since 2005. Now, 18 years later, now I find myself with my wife and my children traveling and spending time together, and another terrible incident happened in southern Israel. An attack from Gaza by Hamas, the same place where the Jews who were expelled to leave in 2005 because they wanted peace, and the same terrorist group who took over Gaza once the Jews left has now attacked Israel. Basically, Hamas has turned Gaza into a terrorist ghetto. This is back in 2005 when we did a prophecy update many years ago about what it would become of Gaza if Hamas were actually a government there and they were voted in. The horrific scenes coming out of Israel. This is day 6 of the war that began on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel at the southern part. We've seen the footage and we have seen the horrific actions by Hamas. They launched an invasion into Israel. They have left over 900 Israeli dead, another 2,000 who have been injured, plus probably more as the days go on. We'll find out more. Some were abducted in the attack. This is considered the worst attack since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, 50 years ago. Those abducted were taken into Gaza and being used as human shields and threatened to be executed by Hamas. By the way, it is estimated 14 of those abductees, or those abducted, I should say, are American citizens, which adds a whole new layer to this dilemma. Israeli authorities estimate that over 3,500 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel. Hamas fighters used from motorcycles to paragliders to running through the border, foot soldiers entering Israeli territory. And of course, there were those who had infiltrated the Israeli society who turned on the Israeli citizens. The horrible scenes that we can't even show you here on YouTube or other platforms, which you can find some of our videos that we will be linking to those images. The beheading of soldiers, even of babies by Hamas. This is something that even the media have tried to deny, even though there's other news outlets that have reported it. Even Joe Biden had to admit this happened. The treatment of women, girls who were taken captives. I watched one video of a man who was glad his daughter, 8 years old, named Emily, was dead and not in Gaza, as you can see from the video.
They just said, "We found Emily. She's dead." And I went, "Yes!" I went, "Yes," and smiled. Because that is the best news of the possibilities that I knew. That was the best possibility that I was hoping for.
And we actually spoke with one man, originally from Ireland, who was separated from his 8-year-old daughter. She had gone to a sleepover at a friend's house who also lived in the kibbutz. And he described to us the agonizing moment. After 2 days of waiting for answers, he was rescued. He finally found out that his 8-year-old daughter, Emily, had been killed.
She was either dead or in Gaza. And if you know anything about what they do to people in Gaza, that is worse than death. That is worse than death. The way they treat you. They'd have no food. They'd have no water. She'd be in a dark room and terrified every minute, hour, day, and possible years to come. So death was a blessing, an absolute blessing.
Now, I have a daughter named Emily, and I remember when she was 8 years old. And this broke my heart to hear her father, who was from Irish descent, in Israel, from Ireland, I should say, and claiming that he was happy and glad that his daughter was not in Gaza, but actually was dead. The Israeli response have been unprecedented. Netanyahu said recently, a couple of days ago, Israel did not start the war, but Israel will finish it. And the warning has come. The IDF has called up 300,000 reservists, and they have struck more than 1,700 targets in Gaza. It's probably more than 2,000 by now. Israeli officials have even called for a doomsday nuclear missile, though they have declined to admit having them. An Israeli official named Revital Tali Gottlieb, an Israeli lawyer and a member of the Knesset of the Likud party, made the comments on X, platform known as Twitter before. They call it Jericho missile, the Jericho missile, strategic alert. And this is, of course, the doomsday weapon that she calls that should be used against Hamas. May God preserve our strength, she said, according to the translation provided by the Twitter, or otherwise known as X now. Only an explosion that shakes the Middle East will restore the country's dignity, strength, and security. Of course, there's an outrage. Israeli officials calling for this. Now, did Israel know about this attack? How much did they know? And how did the intelligence regarding terrorists, how did the intelligence agencies failed? Now, these are questions that are surrounding Israel, many questions that I even have myself. The intelligence community were overwhelmed by Hamas. Now, this is one of the most protected borders in the world. It tells you how, I guess you could say how, maybe not so easily, but how strategically, even one of the most secure borders in the world can be penetrated. Former IDF officials said there was no way Israeli authorities didn't know about this attack. And the speculations continue to mount over the simultaneous failures of the intelligence agency following the attack that is the worst in 50 years. Now, this former intelligence agency agent with the IDF is raising questions how the recent attack from the militant Islamic group Hamas happened without detection. And this is something we brought up in even one of our earlier videos, is the fact that they happened so suddenly, it overwhelmed not only the intelligence agencies were overwhelmed, the IDF was overwhelmed, but even the Iron Dome was overwhelmed. Now, Egyptian intelligence claims that Israel had ignored the warnings. This is something we'll talk about at the end, that they have been warned about an explosion of the situation that's coming very soon. And Egyptian intelligence officials said that Israel ignored or underestimated such warnings. It's really hard to tell, isn't it, whether or not they knew or how much they knew, or whether they were underestimating it or just simply ignore it. An anonymous intelligence agency from Egypt says Israel ignored these things. And remember, 1,000 people have died as a result of these escalating clashes. Israelis have died between Hamas and Israeli forces. There's lots of questions and much that Israel needs to answer. Now, there was also Hamas training videos, which you can see here. There's also international observers concerned about the water supply in Gaza. They said, oh no, don't cut off the water supply. But did you know that Hamas had released videos of how they use Gaza's water pipes to turn them into missiles against Israeli civilians? Well, these things have been known. Now, the elephant in the room is this. What about the $6 billion of assets which were unfrozen by the U.S. administration, the Joe Biden, the Obamas, Anthony Blinken, the deep state, and the globalists allowed the $6 billion of assets to be unfrozen and given access to Iran, the government of Iran? Even Joe Biden has admitted this was to help in order to release American hostages. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said Iran promised, they said, it's like a pinky promise, that they would only use it for food, medical, and for people, or for the people of Iran. They said, Blinken said, well, they said they promised. Well, remember, Iran, which is a Muslim country, has, and within Islam, has a doctrine of permissible lying if it's going to advance the cause of Islam, which is a whole other video. But they have a doctrine within Islam which allows you to deceive your enemy in order to gain the upper hand. And so, did they do this? Well, seemingly. We've had the videos of the president of Iran who said that they'll use it however way they want, and they don't want anybody else telling them what to do with it. Well, certainly, this $6 billion have helped fund many of the organizations, the terrorist organizations that Iran loves to fund in order to perpetrate attacks on Israel. The Biden administration is now taking heat for this, and rightly so, given Iran $6 billion access, $6 billion in access in order for the release of the hostages just a month ago, which now Hamas is attacking and using some of those funds in order to attack Israel. And some people saying, well, those are not the funds. Well, when you commingle funds, you can't say that these were not funds that were given access by the American administration. You could say that because once they have access, they can buy or they can pay for these terrorists, this resources, this weaponry, with the money that they wouldn't have had unless the Biden administration had given them access. But now this is just a tip of the iceberg, though. Now we've been bellyaching about the $6 billion. What if I tell you there's much more than that? The money trail with Iran is worse than what you think. And also, they were given billions of dollars, access to other billions of dollars from other countries, while the U.S. officials have quietly acknowledged that they're allowing Iran to export more oil to China. So they not only come with the $6 billion, but access to more of billions of dollars, but also the permission by the U.S. government for Iran to export more oil to China, which of course ends up being more profitable for Iran. In the end, Iran has had access to about $50 billion. It's the latest estimate. Not $6 billion with a B, $50 billion. And that's not all. The Biden administration has allowed much more for Iran to take advantage of the West's inability or gullibility to deal with the Republic of Iran and their shenanigans. The Biden administration is very much tied into the Iranian government, who has basically Biden's administration has pushed to do deals with the Iranian government, just as much as the Obama days with Valerie Jarrett, if you remember those days, where even some question whether Valerie Jarrett was an Iranian plant, an Iranian spy. Now, Trump, and with all his faults and with all his issues, was right, as well as other conservative politicians who said that this would lead, if the unfreezing of the assets will lead to a greater access for terrorists, money for terrorists, that they'll have access to this money, and this money could be used for attacks. And they said this a month ago. A month ago, they warned that these could lead to more attacks by terrorists once Iran has access to this money. And believe me, it was much more than $6 billion. And you know what? They were right. They were right about what this would lead to. Now, another elephant in the room is this. The Iranian officials who helped this this surprise attack of October 7th. According to news reports, Iran has denied it, but certainly Hamas has been working with Iran for some months. Remember, Iran does not only support Hamas, they've sent money to Hamas, they've supported Hamas, but also Hezbollah, which is in the north, which is what we call Lebanon today, biblical names Tyre and Sidon. So this has been planned, well planned for some time, which is, it continues, no doubt, will bring more nations into war. So if this continues, this will bring more nations into the war. But what about something that no one's really been talking about, which is the cyber attacks, the cyber threats? We have also received information that there have been cyber attacks and cyber threats from hacker groups who have joined in the Israel-Hamas conflict and the escalation that started over the weekend. The Hamas group, the militant group that launched the major attack, that left close to 1,000, if not more, Israelis killed. They are now working on a cyber attack against Israel. Now, this is going back and forth between Iran and Israel as well. Israel has been threatened by cyber threats. It's not just Israel, by the way, but it's also the U.S. and European Union. This is the war behind the war. There's a war that we can see, and then there's a cyber war that's being waged at this moment. And this is something we have to really keep an eye on, because it's not just Israel. It's the U.S., it's Europe, it's the U.K., it's Australia, it's New Zealand, it's Canada. As we get closer and closer to a possible land invasion of Gaza, these cyber threats are going to continue to escalate. Now, remember, the World Economic Forum have waged this idea. They waged war on cyber attacks, and they said, well, we need to stop them. And they even had a whole process called the cyber polygon, which they basically ran a scenario. Well, what would happen if the nations of the world were shut down, if the internet was shut down? So this is something that is happening today. Lo and behold, at the same time, a major war is escalating. Another question that needs to come up is, when will Israel attack and invade Gaza? And one of the questions that I've had is are we seeing, as Bible-believing Christians, are we seeing the fulfillment of a Bible prophecy that has been there in Scripture for a long time? And this is regarding the city associated with the city called Gaza. Now, Gaza today, the inhabitants there were back then were the Philistines. They occupy the 5 cities in the area of the Philistines, which included Gaza as well as Ashkelon, right? Ekron. These were the cities where even the ancient hero of Israel, Samson, went in and defeated the Philistines, where David subdued the Philistines finally. So the area of Gaza has been going on for some time. It's been known in the Bible for quite a number of passages. It's a city associated with judgment. The book of Jeremiah, the prophet Amos, and Zephaniah and Zechariah all prophesied that the judgment of Gaza would come because of the sins of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines have long been disappeared, and God has judged the Philistines. But the city of Gaza continues to exist, and the people that live in Gaza have perpetrated the same attitude, the same spirit, the same attacks upon the nation of Israel, upon the Jews. And the book of Amos records that God's judgment on Gaza will be for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up to Edom. Now, it's fascinating that God was going to punish Gaza, the inhabitants of Gaza, because of what they did to the people that were there, and they deliver them up to sex slaves, trafficking slaves, to Edom. And they did this back in the time of the prophets in the Old Testament. It's quite interesting that this is exactly what they did to the Jews that were abducted from Israel into Gaza, were taken into Gaza. And God says, I will send fire upon the walls of Gaza and devour her strongholds. Very strong warning against Gaza. And of course, in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 4, this is something we did a study on, the cities of refuge. From Zephaniah, his name means to be hidden in God. Zephaniah, to be hidden in God. And the only place you're going to be hidden from the wrath of God, because it's about the day of the Lord, is in Christ. And the rock that he gave us, the rock in which we stand, is the rock of Christ Jesus. It's the only place where we can have refuge. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee, says the old song. Chapter 2, verse 4, Gaza will be abandoned. Ashkelon will be a desolation. Ashdod, another city in the area of the Philistines, right by the coast, which would include Ashdod, Ekron, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And it says here, Ashdod will be driven out at noon, and Ekron will be uprooted. Woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of the Kerethites. The word of the Lord is against you. And that has to do with those who promote violence, a segment of the Philistines with the roots of Crete. Remember, the Philistines came from Crete, the book of Amos says. So they were very violent in those areas, and God was going to carry a great judgment upon the area of Gaza. And it's quite interesting that although these prophecies had a near fulfillment, the book of Jeremiah chapter 25, Zechariah chapter 9, all relate to the destruction of Gaza, or the judgments on Gaza. We know King Sargon of Assyria conquered Gaza and destroyed it probably around 720 BC, shortly after the conquering of Israel by the same empire, the Assyrian Empire, I should say. And this were done in 720 BC. Remember, 721 to 722 BC were the attacks, the siege and the attacks upon Israel from the Assyrian. So you had Gaza, you have Ashkelon, you have Ashdod, you had Gath, that's where Goliath was from, who fought David, and Ekron. Those were the 5 cities of the Philistines who make up that area where the Philistines lived near the coast. Now that area is of course much smaller than what they had, but it was there during that time of David, time of Saul, time of the kings, time of the judges, that were a thorn on Israel's side. Now King Sargon of Assyria destroyed Gaza. Later, it was Alexander the Great who destroyed the city again in 332 BC after a lengthy battle. And during the Maccabean period, Jonathan subjugated Gaza to Israel. So during that time, Gaza served as a vassal state of Israel. Gaza was a city associated as well in the New Testament with the preaching of the gospel. The New Testament mentions Gaza in the book of Acts as Philip, the evangelist, is told to go south on the road to the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is Acts chapter 8. And on the road to Gaza, Philip shared the gospel with the Ethiopian eunuch and subsequently baptized him. And this is quite an amazing city because the city was filled with hostility at one point toward Israel. Is filled with the Lord's grace and bringing a Ethiopian to hear the grace and the word of God in the gospel. So it's a wonderful thing that happened there. But the Bible also associates Gaza mainly with the sins of the Philistines, meaning the inhabitants there who commit the same sins of the Philistines will also receive the judgment of God that had been served in other times previously. As I said, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Amos all described a judgment against the Philistines. The Bible associates this, that God has given the city to Judah, but the Israelites failed to obey the Lord. This is back in the book of Numbers. Gaza, this area was given to the people of God, but because of the sins of Israel, they forgot to obey the Lord. They did not obey the Lord. And the Israelites failed to obey God in driving out the former occupants of this land. Because of their disobedience, the Philistines stayed in Gaza and remained a thorn on Israel's side for centuries. Just read the book of Judges for that. And so are we seeing this? And this is quite, this is probably an important part of this update is, are we seeing a Bible prophecy coming to pass as God begins to, he did not forget these judgments upon those who participate in the sins of Gaza. Remember, this has been done before. Once the demolition of Gaza begins, it is my opinion that other nations will get involved into the fray. This could be a world conflict. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Syria, Russia, Iran, of course, as they see what the media will show is Israel's aggression, the whole world's opinion will turn. It's already turning, even though the invasion hasn't started. Now, let's talk about the China factor. The China factor is a very important factor to remember because China is attempting, in my opinion, to draw the U.S. into a conflict. And this is the conflict that I believe we're going to see if it continues. Now, God can put a stop to all this, of course, but we're going to see this. And it's what China is attempting to draw into 4 separate wars. One with the terrorist groups, which, of course, is sponsored by Iran. But experts claim that the CCP has played a role in the recent attack against Israel, meaning that they have supported Hamas, noting that China formed a strategic alliance with Palestine months before the assault. So they have done agreements with Palestine. Remember, China had even agreed to broker a peace deal between Israel and Palestine. Xi Jinping, the president of China, did not actually he did comment, but basically said both sides need to get along, but he did not condemn the attack of Hamas. Even Chuck Schumer, which I don't really have a lot to say about Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, criticized Xi Jinping for his soft-handed approach against Hamas. However, one possibility to consider is that Hamas attack is part of a widespread effort by China to weaken the United States by drawing them into multiple simultaneous conflicts. This is into, I believe, 4 different conflicts. And some people have addressed this in other news outlets that China may be looking to really wear out the U.S. And I think they're going to use North Korea as well as the deals and forces with Iran to really draw the U.S. into a very thin position. North Korea arms have been found in inventory weapons in Hamas that they fired against Israel, a claim that was verified by the EOD, the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist, who spoke to U.S. News. So Hamas has been using North Korean weapons. North Korea has sold weapons to Syria, to Iran, to Egypt, and to Qatar. So these 4 wars, which will be basically the Russian-Ukraine war included into that, as they supported Russia. Of course, it would be one situation would be the Hamas-Israeli conflict. Another one could very well be the Taiwanese conflict that's coming up. And of course, if Taiwan is invaded, can the U.S. really afford to go not only after Russia, not only after Iran, not only after China, but also what about the other drug cartels in Latin America who have been pretty much been at war with the U.S. in our southern border? So as the U.S. is drawn into these borders, it is China's at China's behest. It would seem to be that the China factor seems to be a very important factor to consider. Now, what about this news? And this is as we finish and we wind down, the news is probably very important to remember, is the call for global jihad. On Friday the 13th, the threat of Hamas is going to be felt. And I think very, very real. We need to consider this. The threat of Hamas by a former leader of Hamas calling for global jihad on Friday the 13th. That would be tomorrow here in the States, as we're recording this on Thursday. All over the world are called, Muslims are called all over the world for global jihad to attack the Jews in different parts of the world. They've been calling this for this Friday because of the conflict with Gaza. The call came about 3 days after the attack, and it was called for a call for global jihad, telling Muslims around the world to attack Jewish people and their supporters on Friday the 13th. So even the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, is warning of possible U.S. terrorist attacks. Now, this is, of course, what I believe is going to come to a persecution of Jews, a continued persecution of Jews, and those who support them, which in a lot of ways, Bible-believing Christians stand with the Jewish people. Western nations who have turned against the Jews have seen this. You've seen this in other parts of the news. Western nations are turning against Jews and against its supporters. Now, one interesting thought was the FDA, the Firearms Tobacco Administration here in the U.S., knowing that guns and ammos were being purchased 9 days ago. They were being purchased different parts of the world, different parts of the U.S., and people were buying them and people were moving them. Then came the attack, and now there's some concerns. Came the attack in Israel. Now there's some concerns regarding the attacks here in the United States. Now, the terrorist attacks have been predicted in the U.S. after Hamas assaulted Israel. Some say that the waves of attacks could hit major U.S. cities over the next 14 months, a time frame that coincides as well with, of course, what you know, it's the 2024 election cycle. So following this weekend's attacks, which resulted in the worst carnage in Israel since the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the U.S. is being warned of similar attacks, a series of attacks that could be carried out domestically. Now, the internal data, the CBP data provided and confirmed by the CBP, reveals that thousands of special interest aliens, quote unquote, as special interest aliens from mostly Middle East countries have been apprehended by Border Patrol while they've been crossing into the U.S. illegally over the last 2 years. So this is something we need to consider, the fact that the southern border and the destruction of the southern border, it's also playing along with this destruction, with the possible attack into the U.S. And it has already in some ways began. The people have been arrested in Los Angeles, multiple cars in Ladera Heights. I know where that is. L.A. was vandalized with swastikas for over many months, setting off fears of white supremacists targeting black majority neighborhoods. Antifa helped bring its attention to the incidents by posting pictures of swastikas on cars. The outcry of the left, of course, is to support Hamas. We have groups like BLM, who supports Hamas in the recent tweet. Protests in Sydney, the Albanese government in Australia giving in direct support to Hamas. London, the U.S. also have some protests, major protests coming for this weekend. One example of the media, it's sports reporter Jackson Frank, who was fired by the Philly Voice for posting and expressing solidarity with Palestine in the Hamas attack. Frank was a Philadelphia 76er beat writer and criticized the team's pro-Israel post on the platform. So the Philadelphia 76ers, which is a basketball team here in the U.S., basically posted that they were support of Israel and pray for Israel, making the retaliation against Hamas by Israel morally equivalent. Making the retaliation against Hamas by Israel moral equivalent to what Hamas has done to the Jewish people. Innocent women and children were blown apart in Gaza. Of course, it's terrible. And children and women being blown apart and massacred in Israel is also terrible. But it doesn't mean that they are morally equivalent. This was a terrorist attack, no doubt. It doesn't make this a wonderful place to live. I agree with that. It's a tragic place to live. In an ideal world, of course, Israel wouldn't have to protect its citizens from Hamas, and there would be no loss of life. But we live in a fallen, sinful world. In an ideal world, Hamas wouldn't even exist. But the ideal world does not exist. Only a sinful, fallen, tragic world. And the tragedy of this war, it is its only beginning. I pray and I weep for the salvation of the Jews and for the salvation of people in Gaza. I pray for the daughters of Gaza. I pray for the daughters of Zion. I pray for the salvation of both people because they both need Christ. But the attack on Hamas against Israel, it is an attack that's been planned, that's been coming. And I pray for the innocent. I pray that righteousness and justice comes to pass. And I pray that God shows mercy upon a fallen, tragic world. But nonetheless, I do believe that these wars are going to continue. Doesn't make it any good, doesn't make it any better. Those that believe that only peaceful things should happen, it's like a beauty queen wishing for world peace when peace is not an option. Making peace with Islam and terrorist groups like Hamas is not an option. Israel has tried it. Remember 2005? Remember 2006? Remember ever since Gaza was taken over by Hamas, they promised peace, but they have not had any peace. Now, for the dumbest statement of the year, I would think this is the one. A BLM rally in Dearborn, Michigan. A person said at the BLM rallies, he was one of the spokespersons at the BLM rallies, that we see a lot of BLM flags here. But at a white supremacist rally, he says, we see a lot of Israeli flags, making the connection that at the BLM rallies, they see Palestinian flags, but at the white supremacist rallies, they see a lot of Israeli flags. This is as dumb as you can get. White supremacists supporting Israeli flags? This is, of course, trying to make the case that BLM should support Palestinians and only white supremacists support Israelis. This is as dumb as you can get. I know Joe Biden and his administration says a lot of dumb things, but this one takes the cake, as they say here. But keep your eyes open as we finish. Keep your eyes open. Be on the alert. Stay prayerful. Jesus said the days prior to his return includes difficult days, include war, false teachers, false teachings, false preachers, false prophets, deception. Jerusalem and the Jews will be at the center. The persecution of believers, and also includes the proclamation of the gospel. These are all things that Jesus said that would come to the last days. The last of the last days would include the proclamation of the gospel as well as persecution of believers and of Jews. This is something a lot of prophecy teachers and ministries don't tell you, and they don't do. They tell you the news, and there's some that just basically read the news, but never give you a biblical or a gospel perspective. They never tell you or equip you for telling others about Jesus, his truth, his forgiveness, his righteousness, his love, his pardon, but also his judgment against those who come against him and his people. To those who are watching and waiting for Jesus, keep preaching Jesus. Preach to those who haven't heard. Preach to those who have not had the opportunity to believe and trust in Jesus. To those who don't preach Jesus, if you're a Christian but you don't preach Jesus to others, why not start today? Tell someone that in these deep, darkest, depressing, fearful days, there's hope in the Messiah of Israel, Jesus Christ. And as my Jewish friends say, Yeshua HaMashiach. Trust in him, repent, believe, be saved. Follow Jesus. God bless you. Thank you for watching. Or I should say, thank you for listening. And may the Lord bless you as you follow on another prophecy update. Keep praying for Israel. Keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. God bless you, my dear brothers and sisters.